Greek word icon is where we get the English word icon. And so that Greek word icon can be translated to image or picture, but more precisely, it's translated to icon. Well, in Genesis, when you look at that passage of God creating us in His image, well, in the Greek version of the book of Genesis, it also uses that word for the word image. It uses that Greek word icon. So a way you could translate this is that we are made to be icons of God. And I think that has a really deep, significant, just imagery and meaning, a little more so than if we just say we're made in the likeness of God. If we say we're made in the likeness of God, which is true, we could interpret it as, we're meant to kind of resemble, or maybe to appear like God. But when we say that we are made to be icons of God, that has such a profound meaning. We can interpret that as we are meant to be just beautiful reflections of something that is sacred. So you think about religious icon images, right? The images that we have in our church, well, not at the moment, but we'll have back in our church, those icons of Mary and the angels, right? Those icons, those types of images are very prominent in the Eastern Church, in the Orthodox Church. They love icons because icons for them are reflections of the sacred. And so a way that we can understand this is that we, being in the image and likeness of God, it means that we are meant to be reflections of the sacred, right? And so it's very important that we understand we are made to be icons of God, reflections of something very sacred to the world. And this idea, again, lays the foundation for moral teaching. Because if we truly believe that we were made out of love, made to be icons of God, reflections of the sacredness of God, well, then that means what we do with our lives, what we do with our bodies, what we do with our free will, it matters. It's important. If we didn't believe that we were made in the image and likeness of God, if we didn't believe that we were meant to be icons of God, then what we do, how we live our lives, what we do with our bodies, whatever, it wouldn't make a difference. But because we are made to be reflections of God, all those things matter. And so that's why this is the foundation of Catholic moral teaching. Because we believe that every single person was made in the image and likeness of God, and therefore what they do with their life, what they do with the gift of the bodies, all of that matters to God and hopefully to that person. So this is a long quote, but very important. And all these quotes are coming from the USCCB, which stands for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. So it's the bishops of the United States. They're putting together this content. But they say here that the second element is the responsible practice of freedom. So the first element of Catholic moral teaching is the teaching that we're made in the image and likeness of God, right? The second element is that we use our free will responsibly. So the second element is the responsible practice of freedom. Without freedom, we cannot speak meaningfully about morality or moral responsibility. Human freedom is more than a capacity to choose between this and that. It is the God-given power to become who He has created us to be, and so to share eternal union with Him. The parts highlighted in blue are very important. This happens when we consistently choose ways that are in harmony with God's plan. Christian morality and God's law are not arbitrary, but specifically given to us for our happiness. Right? So how do we responsibly practice our freedom? Well, when we constantly choose to live our life in ways that are in harmony with God's plans. And so, what is the purpose of Christian morality, living a moral life? Well, it's for our ultimate happiness. God gave us intelligence, reason, and the capacity to act freely. Ultimately, human freedom lies in our free decision to say yes to God. In contrast, many people today understand human freedom merely as the ability to make a choice. So lots of people in this world simply look at free will or freedom as is I can choose whatever I want. And most often it's I can choose what makes me feel good. I can choose what is pleasurable, what makes me happy. But for us as Christians, as Catholic Christians, our choosing, our use of free will is not just simply choosing whatever, but it's doing and living and choosing that which is in accordance or harmony with God's plan. Why would we want to choose to live and act in a way that's in accordance with God's plan? Because it leads to our ultimate happiness. And when we live according to God's plan, it's us, in essence, saying yes to God. Yes, I believe in you. Yes, I believe your teachings. Yes, I want to live and follow your plan. So, first element of Catholic moral teaching is this belief and understanding that each one of us were made in the image and likeness of God, right? I think in a more profound way to say we are supposed to be icons, reflections of the sacredness of God to the world. And so because we are made in the image and likeness of God, each person has incredible dignity and a value as a human person. And secondly, is to understand that we have free will. We can choose right from wrong. And it's up to us to responsibly practice this freedom. It's not just choosing whatever we want, but it's making the choice that leads to our happiness, making choices that are in harmony with God's plan, and it's our decision ultimately to say yes to God. So now we have a little video that will also hopefully help lay some foundations for understanding Catholic moral teaching.
Think about the biggest decision you've made today, this week, or this month. Did you choose well? Was it the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do? When we choose what is good and avoid evil, we grow in God's grace and become holier. So it's really important to be able to determine whether our actions are good or not. Let's say you just got a new electronic device. As you're reading through the instruction manual to figure out its features and how it works, you come across words in big, bold print that reads, "Do not submerge in water." Would your response be, "How dare these people tell me what I can and can't do with my device? They don't even know me. This is my device and I can do whatever I want, whenever I want, and however I want with it"? No. Most people wouldn't even think that because we all know that water and electronic devices don't mix well. In fact, water could ruin my device. But have you ever heard these words? "This is my life," or "This is my body. I can do whatever I want, whenever I want, however I want with my life." I've heard and maybe even said things that resemble these statements. However, this mentality does not work for our ultimate good. God created us for a life with Him, and He has a plan for us. He knows what will break us and what will fulfill us. So, He sets before us an instruction manual, rules and guidelines that teach us right from wrong, so we can avoid damage to our souls and to live in unity with Him. So how do we know when an act is right or wrong? Does it conform to God's will or not? When we're talking about the moral goodness of an act, we're talking about how God sees it in its entirety. He's not only concerned with what we do, but also why we do it and when, where, and how we do it. The church gives us 3 elements that determine whether an act is morally right or wrong. All 3 of these elements have to be good in order for the act as a whole to be good. The first and most important element is the object, what we do. The second element is our intention, why we do it. And the third is the circumstances surrounding the action, the when, where, and how it's done. Now this is a silly example, but it demonstrates how these elements work. Let's pretend I'm on a field trip at a museum with my class. At the end of a long day of walking around, my feet are tired. When we get to the exit of the building, there's a sign and a few chairs that says visitor seating. I choose to sit for the intention of resting my feet in the proper designated area. Now, choosing this doesn't make me a saint, but all of the elements are good. Therefore, there's nothing bad about my decision. Let's change it up and say that there's a classmate that I really don't like. And as we're touring the museum, I heard her talk about how she sprained her ankle and couldn't wait to sit down. So, as we approach the exit of the building, I see that there is one chair left. So I speed up a little bit and I take it so she can't have it. Even though the object of sitting is neutral, my intention is motivated by malice, thus it is not in conformity with God's will. So that action as a whole is morally wrong. Okay, let's change the circumstances. So I'm walking around this museum all day, and all I want to do is rest my tired feet. I glance up to see this beautiful gold-trimmed chair with red velvet lining and a rope around it with a sign that reads, "Exhibit, do not touch." But I think to myself, wow, that looks really comfortable, and my feet really hurt. So I go and I sit down. That action is not morally acceptable because the circumstances don't allow me to sit in that chair. Hopefully now we see how the object, intention, and circumstances determine the righteousness or lack thereof of an action. In the example I gave, I used a morally neutral object, sitting. There are, however, objects or actions that are intrinsically evil, meaning they are always wrong despite the goodness of the intention or the circumstances. Some examples of intrinsically evil objects include blasphemy, murder, direct abortion, adultery, and idolatry. These things are never permitted because they are incompatible with the love of God and neighbor. So it's important to educate ourselves in the moral law that God has handed down through scripture and tradition. Blessed Louise Tazo once said, "God's invitation to become saints is for all, not just a few. Sanctity, therefore, must be accessible to all." In what does it consist? In a lot of activity? No. In doing extraordinary things? No. For this could not be for everybody and at all times. Therefore, sanctity consists in doing good, and in doing this good in whatever condition and place God has placed us. Strive to lead a good moral life by studying God's law, listening to the teachings of the church, practicing the virtues, forming your conscience, and working with God's abundant grace to conform your life to His will and grow in sanctity.
So that video hopefully gave just some basic principles that are really important for understanding our actions and whether or not they are wrong or immoral. And so just to kind of recap here, the church teaches that every moral act consists of three elements: the object, the objective act itself, what you're doing; the goal or intention, right? What is the motivation for why somebody does the act? And then the concrete situation or circumstances. As the video says, the where, when, how, with whom, the consequences, etc. All three elements are important because all three elements will determine whether or not something is immoral or whether something is morally acceptable. Also, those three elements can help us determine whether or not something we do is gravely immoral versus lesser or a smaller sin. So the church also teaches in regards to sinful acts, there are serious, grave acts, which we also call mortal sins. And then there are those lesser, smaller sins called venial sins. And so these three elements can also help us understand, is what I'm doing or what I have done, is it serious in the eyes of the church, or is it smaller or lesser, venial in the eyes of the church? So these three criteria or elements, the objective act, right, the intention, and the circumstances are very important in judging and discerning whether acts are immoral or not. So also the video touched on sometimes things can be evil part of the time, and sometimes things are always considered evil. So some actions are not by themselves morally wrong or evil, but can become wrong or evil based on the intention and the circumstance. So the example she gave, the simple act of sitting down, well, it's neutral, right? Just the action of sitting is not, of course, morally wrong. However, if the intention or the circumstance, right, is in the right place, the action of sitting could be immoral or evil. The example she gave at the end is, right, if you're in a museum and there's a fancy chair and there's a sign that clearly says, don't touch, don't sit, but you choose to sit anyway, well, even though the action of sitting itself is not wrong, because the circumstances didn't permit you to sit there, well, now you have committed a morally impermissible or evil act. There are some actions, of course, that the church will define that are always wrong and evil, regardless of the intention or circumstance, which we call intrinsically evil acts. Those are acts that are evil or wrong just because of the act itself is always going to be inherently wrong and evil. And she gave some examples in the video of some of those acts. And so we have to, of course, when we're judging or determining whether or not something is moral or immoral, we have to ask ourselves, is this something that is intrinsically evil, always evil or wrong, or is this something that sometimes could be evil based on the circumstance and then sometimes not be evil? Though really the best way to understand is something moral or immoral in the church is to study the faith and to learn what the church teaches about all these different kinds of topics. So, what are some of the major moral issues in the church, right? Life issues, such as abortion, suicide, euthanasia, issues regarding marriage and sexuality, things like SSA, which means same-sex attraction, gender identity issues, contraception, things like IVF, which is in vitro fertilization, right? So any issues that deal with the nature of marriage, the nature of human sexuality, issues regarding medical and bioethical issues. So there can be moral issues regarding the nature of vaccines and taking vaccines, other types of medical treatment, things like genetic modification, right? Issues like social justice, dealing with racism, labor and worker rights, or issues regarding the environment, things that deal with care for creation. So these are just some general subjects where there are major moral issues that come up in the church. This is very important. The church, the Catholic Church, does not see all of these issues or these categories of issues as equal, right? Issues regarding life are far more significant to God and the church than care for the environment. And that is not to say that the church or God says don't care for the planet, of course not. But the church would never put on the same level, the issue of like recycling on the same level as abortion. Recycling, yes, we want to do our part to reduce and reuse waste. However, that can't be compared to abortion, the intentional killing of human life. So this is very important, that the church would not see some of these issues on the same level. Now, this is very important because when it comes to election period, when it comes to the time when we as Catholics or Christians have to vote, we have to understand these issues in regards to the candidates that we choose, right? A candidate running for office that supports some of these horrific issues like abortion, whatever, that would be a big red flag for us as Catholics to go, wait, I can't vote for this person. That's much different than a candidate who, of course, maybe doesn't always follow some of the best environmental or care for creation practices. So understanding that these issues are not on the same plane, the same level, that some, like life issues and marriage and sexuality issues, are far more significant and severe in the eyes of the church than some of these other ones, that's important because it's going to affect how we vote. It's going to affect, the different issues that we advocate and promote. And while all these issues are important, of course, in some way or another to the church, they're not always seen on the same level. Life issues, marriage and sexuality issues are always going to be the top or the priority, preeminent issues for the church. These other ones, again, are important, but this is kind of like most important to least important in the eyes of the church. And understanding this idea is important, again, because it's going to influence how we vote as Catholics. Also, it's going to affect how we engage in just government, political sphere, and just some of the issues and things that we might choose to support or not support. Understanding which issues are really important for the church versus less important for the church. But this just gives you an idea of some of the generic or kind of the categories of issues that we have moral issues in, that we have teachings that we specifically, all of these things we have specific teachings for. And so it's important for us as Catholics to learn what does the church teach about these different things. We don't have the time to go through all of these things tonight, but to understand what does the church teach so that we can make informed decisions, so that we can, of course, promote and defend the truth of Jesus and his church. So it is important for us to take time to learn about these teachings, not only what the church teaches about them, but also why the church teaches what they do about some of these things. So again, we're not going to have the time to go into these specific issues tonight, but just give you an overview of some of the important moral issues that the church teaches about and the church faces. So what is the basis for all of our Catholic moral teaching? Well, the narrator of the video mentioned it. One, sacred scripture, right? Pretty much every single moral teaching that we have in the Catholic Church is rooted in the Bible in some way, right? And we can look specifically to, like the Ten Commandments. They clearly give us moral teaching. We can look to Jesus' specific teachings in the Gospels, like when Jesus gives the Beatitudes. And then we have, of course, sacred tradition, which are the teachings of the church that have been handed down throughout these centuries, right? From the apostles themselves through the subsequent leaders to today. And the best source for all the teachings of the church, particularly all these moral teachings, would be the Catechism of the Catholic Church, that big green book that has all the teachings in it. And so the two sources, again, this is the sources for all the church's teaching, but specifically for Catholic moral teaching, we get our teaching from both sacred scripture, the Bible, and of course, sacred tradition, all the teaching that have been handed down throughout the centuries. So, with this kind of foundation, this basic foundation of Catholic moral teaching, well, how do we then live out? If we have a desire to live according to God's plan, if we have a desire to say yes to God, so how do we live out our lives as Catholics in the right way so we are in accordance with God and his moral teaching? Well, one, we have to understand that there is such a thing as sin and that it's real, and that sin is something that damages our soul. That every time we commit a sin or an offense against God, that it harms us spiritually. So there are people in the world that sadly don't believe in the realities of right and wrong and don't believe that there is such a thing as sin. So first of all, we have to understand that we can choose sinful things, that there are things out there that exist that are immoral, that are evil, that are wrong. So we have to believe in sin, understand that it's real. We also have to realize as Christians our need for God's mercy. So once we recognize, okay, yes, sin exists, and I have the capacity to do bad things. Well, we also have to believe and understand that God is merciful and he's willing to forgive us of our faults and failings. We have to take the time to know and learn the specific teachings of the church. Specifically, it's important for us to learn the teachings of the church in these kinds of issues. Because my bet is each one of us at some point in time in life has been approached by somebody else and asking us, hey, you're a Catholic or you're a Christian, what do you believe about this? Or maybe we have family members or friends who have dealt with some of these issues and we don't know how to respond or to explain or to accompany them during these things. So to take the time to understand the church's teachings about these specific categories and areas is going to be really, really important, because we can't make good moral decisions if we don't understand the teachings of the church. Not only understanding what the church teaches, but really important, understanding, well, why does the church teach it, right? So we can know that, okay, murder is wrong, but why is that wrong? So we have to understand the what of what the church teaches, but also take the time to understand the why. Why does the church teach this particular thing? And the great thing for us now in today's day and age, there are many, many resources where you can find great explanations for what and why the church teaches, right? If you just go on Google and do a search, you'll find great resources. A great resource that I always turn to if I'm looking for a good explanation for something is Catholic Answers is a great resource. EWTN, their website, has great articles that explains the teachings of the church. You can find great video resources on YouTube from Ascension Presents. And so there are lots of great resources out there to help us learn and understand the church's teaching. Obviously, like I mentioned before, just getting out the catechism of the Catholic Church and reading what the catechism actually says. That's the official teaching. That's the official book that explains all the teachings. Knowing the church's teaching is very important. And then, what is the opposite of vice or sin? Well, it's virtue. So striving each and every day to live virtuously. And of course, there are many, many virtues to strive for in the Christian Catholic faith. But of course, some of the most important virtues for us to live and try to strive for are what is defined as the cardinal and the theological virtues. The cardinal virtues are a set of 4 virtues: courage or fortitude, prudence, temperance, and justice. And then the theological virtues are a set of 3 virtues, and the theological virtues are the most important virtues for a Christian, and those are the virtues of faith, hope, and love. Right? So the cardinal virtues and the theological virtues are really important virtues that we can strive for. Fortitude, prudence, temperance, and justice, and then faith, hope, and love. Of course, there are many, many other virtues which we should strive for: patience, understanding, kindness, joy, right? It's endless. But these are some of the most important virtues that we should strive, because the theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, they kind of govern and oversee the cardinal virtues, and the cardinal virtues with the theological virtues kind of oversees all the other virtues that we can live. So if we want to start living in accordance to God and His church, if we want to start living a good moral life, well, we have to strive for virtue, because virtue is the opposite of sin and vice. And then, lastly, we have to understand and believe in us that all the moral teachings of the church are oriented towards our ultimate good. The whole purpose of striving for virtue, the whole purpose of trying to follow the teachings of the church to live a morally upstanding life is because it's oriented towards our ultimate good, which is to be with God forever in His kingdom. So the whole purpose of this, trying to live in accordance to God, saying yes to God and His teachings, is that it's going to help us get closer to God and to that ultimate reality, which is heaven. So to kind of conclude this discussion or this presentation tonight, this is also from the Catholic bishops of the U.S. They say that scripturally and theologically, the Christian moral life begins with a loving relationship with God, a covenant of love made possible by the sacrifice of Christ. The commandments and the other moral rules are given to us as ways of protecting the values that foster love of God and others. They provide us with ways to express love, sometimes forbidding whatever contradicts love. So it's very easy, again, for us to look at all the teachings, the moral teachings of the Catholic Church, and just go, well, they're just taking away my freedom. These teachings are taking away my fun and my ability to do what I want to do. Well, no, sometimes the church forbids something because it contradicts true love. And sometimes it's not for our ultimate good, right? God has put in place some of these particular teachings and moral beliefs because he knows that if we do the contrary, it's not going to lead us to our ultimate good, which is union with God. So all of these things, again, they're there in place not to take away our fun, not to limit our life, but to lead us closer to God and ultimately the heavenly reward. And so, again, it begins with a relationship, a loving relationship with God, right? Made possible by the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. And again, the commandments and other moral rules are given to us as ways of protecting the values that foster love of God and others. So, kind of a shorter presentation tonight, but I wanted to leave some room for discussion or any questions or comments.
Well, it can't be all white and black.
No, it's true.
Because if I have two candidates to vote for,
Yep.
and one of them espouses something against what the Catholic religion believes, and the other one is evil in itself, I have to make a choice.
That's very true. That's very true. But that's why it's important. So we could spend a whole presentation talking about, Catholic ethics regarding politics and voting. I don't want to get too much into it. But what's important, though, is when it comes time for us to vote for a candidate, yes, is it important for us to look at the character of that particular candidate? Sure. But what's equally as important, if not more so, are the issues that that candidate supports or doesn't support. And it's really important for us to understand that not all moral issues in the eyes of the church are seen on an equal playing field. Issues against life are always the preeminent, most important issues for the church, right? They're not going to be on the same level as our issues regarding the planet and the environment are never going to be on the same level as protecting life. And so one of the ways that we can help ourselves make sure, come election time, that we do vote for the right candidate or the right person is to make sure, we look at the person and their character, but also, just as importantly, if not more so, we look at what issues does he or she support. And are these issues severe, preeminent issues? Are they lesser issues? And are these issues in conformity with Christ and the church or not? Sometimes you're going to have to go, this candidate supports this issue that the church doesn't support, but this candidate also supports issues that the church doesn't support. If for me, I have to go, which of the issues are more important to the church? Okay, this candidate supports something that's kind of down here. This candidate supports things that are gravely, gravely wrong, intrinsically evil, always wrong. Well, I'd have to go, I can't support that candidate that's supporting things that are always evil. I guess I'll have to pick the lesser of the two evils and support this candidate. Even though he might be supporting something not great, he or she is at least not supporting something that's always wrong. So understanding what are the issues a candidate supports. Are those issues things that are always evil, intrinsically evil, or sometimes evil? Yes, take into account their personality and their character, but it's the issues that they support. That's going to always be the big one for us, because we can't support candidates or people who are going to do horrific things that are, in the eyes of the church and God, always wrong and evil. But that's a great example of where there's gray area. And those kinds of situations, we have to pray and discern and do our research, right? So when we get that voter's pamphlet, we should be reading the biography of each of the candidates and where did they go to school? What is their upbringing? Do they have a faith background? I remember one year I was reading the voter's pamphlet and I didn't know any of the candidates, but I saw in one of the descriptions, one of the candidates put in his bio that he was a member of the Knights of Columbus. And so that doesn't guarantee, he's not Catholic, but at least that told me, he's part of the Catholic Church because the Knights of Columbus is clearly a Catholic organization. So that was the indication, he's probably a little safer than some of these other ones because at least he's identifying with something that's Catholic. So you got to do the research on each candidate. You got to pray and discern. One phrase they use in the video, which is really important, to form your conscience, meaning to understand the church's teachings. Teachings are more important in the eyes of the church. Being able to discern the best you can which actions, which issues are more severe than the others, and then praying and discerning as you look at the potential candidates for an office. It's a gray area.
So if I choose wrong, is that a sin in the eyes of God? Is that something that I can repent for?
Only if you knew that you were choosing wrong, right? There are sometimes we choose just for whatever reason, and maybe out of ignorance because we don't know any better, or because we weren't really informed. I mean, but if we knew that this candidate promoted something really, really wrong, and we voted for him or her anyway, I think that we would be incurring some guilt there, right? But God's merciful, and if you recognize that and say, oh, God, maybe I shouldn't have voted for that person, well, we showed contrition. God will be merciful. But that's why we got to take the time to know the teachings of the church, pray and form our conscience, and to make sure that when it comes time to make those kind of hard choices, we're choosing correctly. And sadly, sometimes it does come down to choosing the lesser of two evils. Right? Sometimes you're going to be faced with two options that aren't really great either, but there's one that's going to be clearly better than the other, and sometimes we just have to choose the one that's slightly better. Right? And that's why understanding the issues and understanding which issues are more important to God and the church, that's a huge, huge help when it comes to something like voting. But the Catholic Church will never tell you, or should never tell you, what particular candidate to vote for. The church can only tell you what the church teaches and say, here's kind of the basic direction you should go when trying to vote, but you have to make the informed choice yourself. But if you made a wrong choice and you realize it later, okay, God's going to recognize, hey, you recognize your mistake, God's merciful.
Thank you.
Very good question. Other questions or comments?
You know, I was going to say, over 350,000 babies are aborted every year.
Uh-huh.
And it seems like the Catholic Church would stand up more at this time, since it's going through the Supreme Court, asking us to pray that they make the right decisions. How do we understand where the church stands in critical times just like this?
What was that last part again?
How do we know where the Catholic Church stands at this time when we know the President has visited with the Pope? And
Okay.
it all seems okay, but is it okay?
Well, again, that's a very good question, very thoughtful question. There's some gray area here. So, one, we know where the church stands clearly on the issue of abortion. Right? The church is always against abortion, because abortion is the intentional killing of human life. The Catholic Church has taught and will always teach that life begins at the moment of conception, and human life ends at the point of natural death. And so life is always sacred. Right? Again, it goes back to this idea that we were made in the image and likeness of God. And so the church is always going to see abortion as wrong, and the church is always going to condemn the act of abortion, certainly going to condemn laws that promote abortion or allow abortion to be more accessible. The church is always going to fight against organizations and institutions that exist to administer abortions. Now, when it comes to maybe particular figures in the political sphere that have been outspoken in their support of something like this, well, the best thing we can do is to pray for them. In regards to what you were saying, it is true. Our president did meet with the Pope. And the reality is, we don't know what was said in that meeting, right? The media was not allowed in. Our president, he gave his thoughts on what was said to him afterwards. We don't know if that was true or not. We don't know. Nobody was in the meeting besides him and the Pope. And so we don't know exactly what words were exchanged. We don't know what the Pope actually said. There's only speculation. All I know is that there are, sadly, leaders, political leaders in the world who identify as Catholic and who do support grave issues like abortion or whatever, and that's not right. And we got to pray for them. We got to pray for them that they come to realize at some point in life that, hey, I'm supporting something really wrong, and pray that they turn away and seek God's forgiveness. We got to pray for those people. But it's not up to us to judge them. God's the judge, and if they are in the wrong at the end of their life, well, God's going to deal with them in His own way. But now we pray that they have a change of heart. They recognize that they're supporting things that are wrong, and we pray for their conversion. That's the best thing we can do. But it's not helpful either for us to make judgments or speculation based off of supposed things that are said in meetings when we really don't know what was said.
Each one of those babies, though, at conception, is that right, that they received a soul?
Oh, yeah. So at the
those
moment,
babies are all cared for in God's hand.
oh, for sure.
Yeah.
At the very moment of conception, right, that life is given an eternal soul by God, and sadly, all those babies that do get killed before they're able to come into the world, well, they're in God's hands, and they're with God now, for sure. But it's sad and horrific that they never had the chance to live their life.
I got one for that. During the history of the church, and then various thoughts on capital punishment.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so how do you approach that nowadays? Since, unborn baby is an innocent life, where somebody on the other end is not an innocent life. So how do you approach that nowadays? So I know the recent popes have written one way, but I know the past other popes.
Sure. Well, gray area. That's gray area. And I don't have the right answer there, because it's true. Previous popes in the history have taught that in very, very, very rare circumstances, capital punishment, death penalty, could be permissible. Well, recent popes have tried to modify that teaching to say that it's never permissible, right? I don't have the answer there. I do believe that if there was an instance that required capital punishment, it would be so extreme and rare. So the whole reason, here's the whole reason why that. So the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the way that it worded that teaching, originally allowed for the rare possibility of the use of capital punishment. But the way they worded it was in such a way that it basically said, well, it's never going to happen. Okay, it might happen, but it's really never going to happen. And so recent popes have just took that a step further and say, well, if we're going to say that it's really never going to happen, let's just say that it's not ever going to happen. Who knows? It's kind of contradictory, because some popes in the past have said, yes, there might be a just cause in rare circumstances, where current popes have tried to change that teaching. I don't have the answer. Yes?
Well, what Dr. Mike said, take it a step further and going to war. Where in this war, killing of another soldier?
Sure.
And why is that right? Why is that ever right?
Okay, that's a good question. So the church actually has a teaching about war called just war theory, where the church will say that in the instance of war, for the sake of peace, if there's no other way to allow peace to happen but the taking of life, then the church can say that it's morally permitted. So another thing we didn't get into, but it's important to understand, even some of these actions that are always evil, intrinsically evil, there can be situations where they might be morally permissible, right? That doesn't take away the fact that they're wrong and evil, but there might be rare circumstances that come up where even though this act is very wrong and evil, it could be seen as morally permissible, meaning that a person could commit this action without incurring any penalty or guilt, right? Those situations are rare. But in the case of taking of life, the church clearly sees a difference between taking human life and murder. Murder is the willful, intentional, deliberate, malicious killing of another human being. Always wrong. When we just say taking life, right? Taking life could mean like you took a life because of self-defense. Because somebody came into your house and tried to attack you, and you could see that this person was charging at you with a knife, and the only way to defend yourself and your family was to take that other person's life. Right? You killed that person, yes. That wasn't murder, you took that person's life, but the church is going to say, well, that was self-defense. That's morally permissible. Same thing with war. The church is going to say, you're fighting as a soldier, defending your country for the sake of peace. Well, in those circumstances, the church could say, okay, you're taking life. Yes, that's wrong, but it's morally permissible because, again, the intention and the circumstances, right, are going to allow for it to happen. So in the case of killing, the church is always going to distinguish between just simply taking a life versus murder. Murder is malicious. Taking life could mean malicious intent, but also could mean taking life for a just cause.
I'm having trouble squaring this with what I'm reading in the Old Testament.
Okay?
Where God instructs Moses to tell the Israelites to wipe out these people and take their land.
Okay.
They end up killing their children and wives and
Mm-hmm.
everything. So
Yeah.
it's hard to square the Old Testament with that.
Sure it is. Well, I don't have a great answer for that, but what I will say is this. Lots of people like to look at the God of the Old Testament as just this angry, violent, vengeful God, and the God of the New Testament, meaning Jesus. Well, Jesus, he's all about love and mercy and forgiveness, and what's the difference? Why is there such a discrepancy? Well, I would say that the God of the Old Testament is one and the same with the God of the New Testament, but if you look at the God in the Old Testament, are there instances where he does horrific things like that? Yes. But there are just as many, if not more, instances in the Old Testament where God is merciful and forgiving and gives chance after chance after chance for his people to repent and turn back. What we see in the Old Testament is God gives so many chances to his people to change their ways, but they just refuse. And God says, okay, that's your free choice. You're choosing not to turn back to me, even though I'm giving you chance after chance. And so punishment is incurred of some sort. I don't know if that helped you, but I would say simply, yes, there's no denying that God has done vengeful, violent things in the Old Testament. However, there is just as many, if not more, instances of God being merciful and forgiving in the Old Testament. But Jesus actually did a very similar thing. Jesus is not actually doing violent acts in the New Testament, but he clearly says over and over, if you don't change your life or if you're doing X, Y, and Z, you are going to